Have you ever wondered what happens when the hunters become the hunted? When the men trained to be invisible, patient, and deadly discover that their enemy has mastered an entirely different kind of invisibility, that the ground beneath their feet hides an entire world designed to turn every advantage they possess into a liability. Specialist 4th Class David Morrison, known to his team as Ghost, understood patience better than most men twice his age. At 23 years old, the Montana native had spent 217 days in Vietnam perfecting the art of waiting. Waiting for the right wind, waiting for the right light, waiting for that single moment when a target's guard dropped just enough. But on the morning of March 17, 1968, outside the village of Cu Chi, Morrison learned that patience has a breaking point. The humidity clung to his skin like a second uniform as he lay motionless in the elephant grass, his M21 rifle resting against his shoulder with the familiar weight of an old friend. In his left breast pocket, folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn soft, sat a photograph of his wife Sarah, 8 months pregnant when he shipped out from Montana. Their daughter would be 3 months old now. He hadn't seen either of them yet. That photograph was his talisman, his reminder that patience wasn't just a tactical skill, it was a promise to come home. But the Viet Cong had their own kind of patience, and their own way of breaking a sniper's composure. When Morrison's spotter, Corporal Jimmy Chen from San Francisco, took a round through the shoulder, a shot that came not from the tree line ahead, but from the earth itself, from an impossible angle below their position, Morrison felt something shift inside him. The wound wasn't fatal, but the message was crystal clear. They knew where the American snipers were. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were laughing. If you're here, we share something extraordinary. A deep respect for the men who fought in conflicts that tested the limits of human endurance and sanity. This channel exists to honor their service with the dignity they earned, whether their war ended in victory, stalemate, or questions that still haunt us decades later. These were real men with real families, facing real terror. Subscribe now and join our community of those who refuse to forget what they sacrificed, even when the purpose of that sacrifice remains debated to this day.
Cu Chi District in March of 1968 existed in a state of perpetual tension. The Tet Offensive had shattered any remaining illusions about how close America was to winning this war. Saigon had burned. Hue had fallen and been retaken at terrible cost. And here in Cu Chi, just 30 kilometers northwest of the capital, the 25th Infantry Division found themselves holding ground that belonged to the enemy every night. The Americans controlled the surface during daylight, but beneath their boots, an entire world operated beyond their reach. The tunnel network at Cu Chi represented 20 years of digging, expanding, and perfecting. It wasn't just a hiding place, it was a complete underground society, 3 levels deep in some places, stretching for over 250 kilometers when you mapped every connection. Command centers, field hospitals, weapons caches, living quarters. The Viet Cong had built an invisible fortress, and they knew every centimeter of it. For the American snipers deployed to the area, this created a tactical nightmare. How do you hunt an enemy who literally vanishes into the earth? How do you maintain overwatch when your target can appear from nowhere, take a shot, and disappear before you can acquire them? The Viet Cong fighters defending Cu Chi knew exactly what psychological impact their tunnels created. They had watched Americans arrive with confidence born from superior firepower, advanced optics, better training, and the certainty that their technology would overcome any guerrilla tactics. And the Vietnamese defenders had learned to turn that confidence into a weapon. They left messages in English near tunnel entrances. "Welcome, American sniper. We see you. Silent killers die quiet too." These weren't random taunts. They were calculated psychological operations designed to unnerve the men who prided themselves on being unshakable. Sergeant Tran Van Min, a 34-year-old tunnel fighter from Hanoi, understood the American snipers better than they might have guessed. Before the war consumed his country, Tran had been a schoolteacher who spoke decent English and loved French literature. Now he commanded a team of tunnel fighters who specialized in countering American reconnaissance. They weren't monsters. They weren't fanatics. They were professionals defending their homeland with the only advantages they possessed: knowledge of terrain and willingness to embrace conditions that would break most soldiers' minds. The darkness, the claustrophobia, the constant threat of collapse, flooding, or poisonous gas. Tran's team endured it all because this was their land, and they refused to yield it. Morrison had arrived in Vietnam with the confidence typical of American snipers. They were the elite, the patient ones, the men who could slow their heartbeats and thread a bullet through a window at 800 meters. His instructors at sniper school had drilled into him that patience and discipline would overcome any enemy. Hold your position. Control your breath. Wait for the perfect shot. Never, ever let emotion compromise your tactical advantage. For 7 months, that doctrine had worked perfectly. 17 confirmed kills, 0 compromises, 0 mistakes. He had earned his nickname honestly. Ghost moved through the jungle like something not quite human, and his targets never knew what hit them. But Jimmy Chen's blood seeping into the red earth changed something fundamental. That shot had come from below. Impossible angle. Perfect placement to wound, but not kill. Another message. Morrison had pulled his spotter back to the firebase, gotten him medevaced out, and returned to his position. But he couldn't focus, couldn't settle into that meditative state where time stretched and every detail became sharp and clear. Because somewhere beneath his hide, someone was watching him. Someone who knew exactly where he was and had chosen not to kill him. Yet, that's when Morrison made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if his command had known about it. He started studying the tunnel entrances instead of the targets, started mapping the patterns in his mind, started to understand that the real enemy wasn't any individual fighter. It was the system itself, the network. And networks, he realized, have vulnerable points, choke points, places where the advantage shifts. Morrison had grown up hunting in the mountains of Montana. He knew that the most dangerous predator could be cornered if you understood its den. He just needed to find the right entrance, the right moment, and enough courage to do something no sniper should ever do: close the distance to point-blank range. The first thing Morrison felt when he lowered himself into the tunnel entrance was the earth itself trying to reject him. His shoulders scraped against walls that seemed to tighten with each breath. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 3 feet, and suddenly, the jungle humidity became a memory replaced by cool, dead air that tasted like clay and old darkness. His hands touched the tunnel floor and came away damp with something that might have been water or condensation or the slow seep of a land saturated with blood and time. This wasn't his world. Every instinct screamed at him to climb back out, to fight in the open where his training meant something. But Jimmy Chen's face, pale with shock and pain, pushed him forward. Someone down here knew where every American position was, and Morrison intended to find out who. The sound came next, or rather, the absence of it. Above ground, the jungle hummed with life. Birds, insects, the distant percussion of artillery. Down here, silence pressed against his eardrums like physical weight. His own breathing became deafening, and Morrison forced himself to slow it, to quiet the rasp of air through his lungs. But then he heard it. Faint at first. A scraping sound. Movement through earth. Someone else was down here, and they were moving with purpose. Morrison's heart hammered against his ribs. He had left his M21 above, useless in these confines, and carried only his M1911 pistol and a flashlight he didn't dare turn on. This was their world. He was the intruder, and they knew he was here. His eyes adjusted slowly to darkness that wasn't quite complete. Thin shafts of light filtered down through camouflaged air holes, creating pools of gray visibility in otherwise absolute black. Morrison could see shapes now. The tunnel branched ahead of him. Left descended deeper. Right seemed to level out. The scraping sound came from the right, but that could be a trick. Everything down here was a trick. He chose left, moving in a crouch that made his thighs burn within minutes. The photograph of Sarah crinkled in his pocket with each movement, and he found himself focusing on that sound. A reminder. He had a reason to survive this insanity. The smell hit him after 10 meters of descent, not the chemical stink of explosives or the decay of bodies, though he'd smelled plenty of both. This was different. Nuoc mam fish sauce, rice, wood smoke trapped underground. Someone lived down here, cooked here. The mundane reality of it shocked Morrison more than fear had. These weren't temporary fighting positions. This was infrastructure. Commitment. He passed a chamber carved from the earth, maybe 5 feet by 6 feet, where supplies sat neatly stacked. Medical bandages, ammunition, a small altar with incense sticks burned down to nubs. Someone's home, someone's sacred space. Morrison felt a strange respect for the dedication required to choose this existence. That's when he tasted it. The copper penny flavor of adrenaline flooding his mouth as shadows moved ahead. Morrison froze, his pistol coming up in a two-handed grip his instructors would have approved of if they could have seen him in this impossible situation. A figure emerged from a side tunnel, and for one stretched second, 2 men existed in the same breath of space. Sergeant Tran Van Min carried an AK-47 that would be devastating in these quarters, but he had it slung across his back. In his hands, he held a canteen and what looked like a rolled map. He was between duties, between moments of war, and he looked as shocked to see Morrison as Morrison was to see him. Neither man fired. The tunnel created its own stalemate. If either opened fire, they'd both likely die in the ricochet and concussion. They stood there, 2 professionals recognizing each other across a chasm wider than the physical space between them. Tran's eyes moved to the photograph sticking out of Morrison's pocket, visible even in the dim light. The corner of it showing Sarah's smile. Tran nodded once, slowly, and Morrison saw something he didn't expect. Tran reached into his own pocket and withdrew a small photo. Morrison couldn't make out details, but he saw enough. Wife, children, 2 men, 6,000 miles from where they'd started, standing in the dark beneath a war neither of them had chosen. Tran spoke first, his English accented but clear. "You are the ghost sniper." Not a question, a statement. Morrison nodded slowly. Tran continued, "You came down here alone. Very brave, very stupid." Morrison couldn't argue with that assessment. His mouth was too dry anyway. Tran studied him for another moment, then said something that made Morrison understand the entire dynamic of this war in a way no briefing ever had. "Up there, you have advantage. Down here, we have advantage." We cannot win your war. You cannot win ours. So we kill each other until someone says stop. The simplicity of it, the tragedy of it, the absolute truth of it. But the moment couldn't last. Voices echoed from deeper in the tunnel system. Vietnamese. Urgent. More fighters were coming. Tran's face hardened, professional mask sliding back into place. He gestured with his head. Up. Get out. Morrison didn't need to be told twice. He backed up, keeping his pistol trained on Tran, who made no move to unsling his rifle. They held each other's gaze until Morrison reached the branch point. Then Morrison turned and scrambled back toward the entrance, his lungs burning, his mind reeling from what had just happened. He emerged into afternoon light that felt like a physical blow after the underground darkness. Morrison sucked in air that tasted like freedom and horror mixed together. He had gone down there to find the enemy. He had found something worse, a reflection. Men doing their jobs with skill and dedication in a war that made sense to no one on the ground level. As he crawled back to his hide, Morrison understood that he had learned something critical. The tunnels weren't invincible. They required maintenance, supply lines, specific routes for movement, and there were places where those routes became predictable, necessary, vulnerable. Later that evening, Morrison sat in the firebase and mapped everything he'd seen. Every turn, every branch, every chamber. His hands shook as he drew, not from fear, but from the adrenaline finally leaving his system. His squad leader, Lieutenant Barnes from Virginia, found him there and wanted to know where the hell he'd been all afternoon. Morrison told him the truth. He'd been underground, alone. Barnes should have written him up, should have relieved him. Instead, the lieutenant looked at Morrison's map, looked at Morrison's face, and said, "Jesus Christ, ghost! What did you find down there?" Morrison's answer came quiet but certain. Their pattern and our opportunity. From 30,000 feet, Chu Chi looked like any other district in South Vietnam's dense agricultural region. Intelligence analysts in air-conditioned rooms at MACV headquarters in Saigon studied reconnaissance photographs and drew lines on maps that meant everything and nothing simultaneously. They knew about the tunnels, of course. Massive operations had been launched to destroy them. Roam plows, tunnel rats, gas, explosive charges. But the tunnel network persisted because it wasn't just military infrastructure. It was survival architecture built by people who had been invaded repeatedly over centuries and learned that going underground meant staying alive. The strategic question facing American commanders in March of 1968 wasn't whether they could destroy the tunnels. It was whether destroying them mattered if the war itself had no clear objective beyond attrition. Morrison didn't think in those terms. He thought in terms of his spotter bleeding out. He thought in terms of 18 more months before rotation home. He thought in terms of doing his job with excellence, even if the larger purpose remained murky. That's what soldiers do. They focus on what they can control. Morrison's map changed everything for Sniper Team Bravo 6. What he had discovered in that brief underground excursion was something intelligence officers had missed in all their aerial surveys and tunnel rat reports. The entrances weren't random. They followed a pattern dictated by geography and tactics. Certain tunnels led to observation posts that gave the Viet Cong perfect fields of fire on American patrol routes. Other tunnels connected to supply caches that needed regular access. And there were specific times, early morning, late afternoon, when those supply runs happened with predictable regularity. Lieutenant Barnes brought in Captain Rodriguez from Battalion Intelligence to review Morrison's findings. Rodriguez, a veteran of previous tours who had learned to respect ground-level intelligence over theoretical analysis, spent 2 hours questioning Morrison about every detail. The dimensions of the tunnels, the smell of the air, the condition of the supplies, the direction voices had come from, and critically, the interaction with Sergeant Tran. Rodriguez understood what Morrison had experienced, two professionals acknowledging each other in a war that neither controlled. "That man let you leave," Rodriguez said quietly. "He could have trapped you, called for help, made you a casualty. Instead, he let you go. You know why?" Morrison did know. Because killing me down there would have meant risking himself and his team in the collapse or chaos. More importantly, because he knew I understood something important, that they weren't monsters, just soldiers. Rodriguez nodded. "And now we use what you learned." The captain outlined a plan that made Morrison's stomach tighten with anticipation and dread. They would position sniper teams not at the tunnel entrances, but at the natural choke points Morrison had identified. Places where tunnels had to surface briefly to avoid underground water tables. Places where the angle of terrain forced tunnel builders to create predictable paths. American snipers would establish overwatch on these points and wait. Wait with the patience that defined their craft. Wait for the moments when Viet Cong fighters had to expose themselves to move supplies, relay messages, or conduct their own reconnaissance. Morrison knew the plan was sound tactically. He also knew it would work because Sergeant Tran and his fighters were doing their jobs exactly as they should. They were using the tunnels as force multipliers. They were maintaining their supply lines. They were adapting to American tactics with the same professionalism Morrison brought to his own mission. This wasn't about outsmarting incompetent opponents. It was about two groups of highly skilled professionals locked in a deadly competition where the terrain would decide the outcome. And for once, Morrison understood the terrain. The operation launched 2 days later. 6 sniper teams deployed to positions Morrison had marked on his map. Concealment was total. They moved before dawn, established hides by first light, and settled into the waiting game that defined sniper warfare. Morrison positioned himself overlooking a dried stream bed that his map showed intersecting with a major tunnel route. The ground here forced any tunnel to surface slightly to avoid the water table. Not enough for a casual observer to notice, but enough that someone moving through would create slight ground disturbance. Enough that air holes would need to be positioned carefully for ventilation. Enough for a patient man with excellent optics to detect movement. 12 hours into the overwatch, Morrison's patience proved itself. The photograph of Sarah rested against his chest, a reminder of why patience mattered. He had explained it once to a new recruit. Patience isn't just waiting. It's understanding when to break your own rules. Morrison had broken every rule by entering those tunnels alone. Now he was back to his original discipline. Waiting, watching, breathing slow and steady. The sun moved across the sky. Birds returned to normalcy after the morning's tension. And then, so subtle Morrison almost missed it, the earth moved. Not much. A slight depression in the ground near the stream bed, right where Morrison's map predicted. An air hole covered with vegetation, but vegetation that moved with breath from below. Morrison's crosshairs settled on the spot. His finger rested outside the trigger guard. Not yet. Not until he had a legitimate target. The rules of engagement were clear, and Morrison followed them absolutely. He waited another hour. Then a hand emerged, brushing away the camouflage. A face followed. Young, maybe 19. A runner carrying messages based on the satchel visible across his back. The young man scanned the area carefully, professionally, then began to emerge from the tunnel. Morrison's shot caught him center mass. Clean. Quick. The way you honored an enemy by making their death as painless as possible. The young runner fell back into the tunnel entrance, and Morrison heard the distant chaos below ground. Voices. Movement. But no one else emerged. They had learned. The lesson cost them one soldier. It could have cost them more, but Morrison didn't take follow-up shots. He had delivered the message. The surface wasn't safe anymore. The patterns had been compromised, and the ghost sniper had found their rhythm. Over the next 4 days, Morrison's intelligence shifted the tactical balance at Cu Chi. Not dramatically. Wars don't turn on single insights or individual actions, but measurably. The Viet Cong tunnel fighters had to alter their movement patterns. Supply runs happened at different times. Air holes got relocated. The psychological advantage shifted back toward the American snipers because now the hunters understood where the hunted would appear. 6 more confirmed kills across all the sniper teams. Each one clean. Each one conducted with professional respect for opponents who were doing their jobs with skill and dedication. Morrison encountered Sergeant Tran one more time, though not face-to-face. 3 days after the first successful overwatch, Morrison spotted a figure at the edge of his field of vision. Too far for a shot, too quick for positive identification. But the movement pattern was distinctive, confident, deliberate, professional. The figure stopped, seemed to look directly at Morrison's hide despite it being perfectly concealed, and raised one hand in what could only be described as a salute, then disappeared back into the jungle. Morrison never confirmed it was Tran, but he knew. 2 professionals acknowledging each other across the violent space between them. American command declared the operation a tactical success. Captain Rodriguez wrote commendations for Morrison and the other team leaders. The citation praised Morrison's initiative and bravery in gathering critical intelligence under extreme personal risk. The words felt hollow to Morrison. He had gone into those tunnels angry about Jimmy Chen. He had emerged understanding something far more complex than anger could accommodate. The enemy was skilled, dedicated, and fighting for their homeland. Every tactical victory Americans achieved came at a cost measured in human lives that mattered just as much as American lives, regardless of which side of the ideological divide they fell on. But Morrison also understood something that would take him years to fully articulate. The soldiers on both sides weren't the problem. They were doing their jobs with remarkable courage and professionalism. The problem lay in a war that asked them to kill each other without clear objectives, without achievable end states, without any vision beyond attrition and body counts. Morrison's tactical success at Cu Chi didn't change the strategic reality. The tunnels remained. The Viet Cong adapted. The war ground forward with its terrible momentum. And young men on both sides continued dying for purposes that remained obscure even to those fighting. The other sniper teams began calling Morrison's technique ghost mapping, using underground reconnaissance to predict surface patterns. It spread through the division. Other units adapted it. For a few months, it provided tactical advantage. Then the Viet Cong adapted further. They always did. That was the nature of this war. Every advantage temporary, every victory partial. every loss permanent. The tunnels at Cu Chi were never destroyed. They exist today as a tourist destination where visitors can barely crawl through sanitized sections and emerge grateful for sunlight after just a few minutes. Morrison visited once, in 2003, and couldn't bring himself to go inside. The memories were too close to the surface. The official records show that Operation Ghostwatch at Cu Chi resulted in 19 confirmed Viet Cong casualties over the 2-week operational period. 19 young men who woke up that morning expecting to survive their duties. 19 families in villages across Vietnam who received the devastating news that their sons, brothers, or fathers wouldn't be coming home. The American side lost 3 soldiers during the same period, 2 to tunnel traps and 1 to a sniper. Morrison never located despite days of searching. Specialist Marcus Johnson from Alabama. Corporal Timothy O'Brien from Boston. Private First Class David Nguyen from California, whose Vietnamese heritage made his death feel particularly tragic to Morrison. All 3 were younger than Morrison. All 3 had families waiting for news that would shatter their worlds. Morrison thought about Sergeant Tran often in the months that followed. About the photograph Tran had shown him in the tunnel. About the fact that Tran was also someone's husband, someone's father, someone's son. The propaganda briefings Morrison attended painted the Viet Cong as faceless enemies. The reality was far more complicated and far more human. These were educated men like Tran, farmers forced into service, village defenders who had known nothing but war for their entire adult lives. They fought with remarkable courage in conditions that would break most soldiers. They deserved recognition for their skill even as Morrison worked to defeat them. Jimmy Chen survived his wound and was medevaced back to the States. Morrison received 1 letter from him, postmarked from San Francisco. Chen thanked Morrison for saving his life, though Morrison didn't recall doing anything heroic, just dragging his spotter back to safety the way anyone would. Chen wrote that his shoulder would never fully recover, that he was being medically discharged, that he was grateful to be going home, but felt guilty about leaving his team. Morrison understood the guilt. Every soldier who rotated home felt it to some degree. The ones who stayed kept dying. Morrison walked the area around Cu Chi 3 weeks after the operation ended. The morning mist clung to the jungle just like it had the day this all started. Birds called to each other with the same indifference to human conflicts. The photograph of Sarah in his pocket was more worn now, the edges soft as cloth. His daughter would be 4 months old. He still hadn't seen her. Wouldn't see her for another 14 months. The war had that kind of weight. It stretched time and compressed it simultaneously. Days lasted forever. Months vanished. Years felt both eternal and fleeting. Near one of the tunnel entrances Morrison had mapped, he found something that stopped him cold. Someone had left a small marker, a stick with fabric tied to it. Not an American marker, not an official Vietnamese marker, just a simple memorial that could have been for anyone. Morrison stood there for a long time, thinking about the young runner he had killed, thinking about the 3 Americans who died, thinking about Sergeant Tran and whether he had survived the war, thinking about all the violence that would be forgotten or simplified or turned into lessons that missed the human cost entirely. He whispered a quiet prayer for all of them. Then he returned to his firebase to continue his tour. Because that's what soldiers do. They honor the fallen by continuing the mission, even when the mission's purpose remains unclear. David Morrison rotated home from Vietnam in July of 1969. He held his daughter Kate for the first time at San Francisco International Airport, and the photograph that had sustained him through 15 months of war finally became a living, breathing reality. Sarah looked older. Morrison felt ancient. Kate, oblivious to everything except the strange man holding her, grabbed his finger and held on. Morrison wept in the terminal, not caring who saw. Those tears carried 14 months of held tension, grief, pride, shame, and relief, mixed into something he couldn't name. The years that followed were harder than combat in some ways. Morrison struggled with nightmares about the tunnels, about Sergeant Tran's face in the darkness, about the young runner he had killed cleanly, but who still appeared in Morrison's dreams, asking why it had to be that way. Morrison didn't have answers. He worked as a hunting guide in Montana, teaching others the patience and respect for nature that had defined his life before the war. He rarely spoke about Vietnam. When he did, it was to other veterans who understood that the war existed in shades of gray that civilians couldn't fully comprehend. He went to therapy in the 1990s when the VA finally started treating PTSD seriously. It helped. Some. In 2003, Morrison returned to Vietnam as part of a veterans' reconciliation trip. The country had changed beyond recognition. Ho Chi Minh City thrummed with economic energy. The war existed as history now, not present reality. Morrison visited the Cu Chi tunnels, now preserved as a historical site. He couldn't bring himself to go inside, but he walked the grounds and tried to reconcile the tourist attraction with the battlefield he remembered. A Vietnamese tour guide, a man about Morrison's age, approached him and asked if he had fought here. Morrison said yes. The guide nodded and said, "My father also, Viet Cong tunnel fighter. He survived. Died last year. Peaceful." They stood together in silence. Two men whose fathers, or in Morrison's case, whose younger self, had tried to kill each other in the name of ideologies neither controlled. Here is what Morrison wants people to understand, and what he told his daughter Kate when she was old enough to ask about his service. The soldiers on both sides served honorably. They followed orders with courage and professionalism. They displayed tactical brilliance and personal bravery. The young men who died in those tunnels, both American and Vietnamese, did their duty with distinction. The fault, when there was fault, lay in the strategic decisions that sent them to fight a war with no clear objectives and no achievable end state. The politicians who committed troops without defining victory. The generals who measured success in body counts. The policies that asked young men to die for purposes that remain debated even now, more than 50 years later. Morrison's skill as a sniper saved American lives. That matters. His intelligence gathering provided tactical advantages that his fellow soldiers needed. That matters. His courage in entering those tunnels alone, driven by loyalty to his wounded spotter, deserves recognition. But Morrison also learned something that shaped the rest of his life. Tactical success doesn't equal strategic victory. You can win every firefight and still lose the war. You can display remarkable courage and still question the wisdom of those who put you in situations requiring that courage. The Viet Cong fighters who defended Cu Chi were not monsters. They were professionals doing their jobs with skill equal to any American unit. Sergeant Tran Van Min, if he survived, deserves the same respect Morrison receives. The young runner Morrison killed was as brave as any American soldier. War creates heroes and tragedies on all sides. The real question isn't who fought with more courage. Both sides displayed extraordinary bravery. The real question is what we learn from wars where courage and skill proved insufficient to achieve clear victories. David Morrison passed away in 2021 at the age of 76. His daughter Kate spoke at his funeral and read from a letter her father had written late in life. "I did my job. I did it well. I'm proud of my service and proud of the men I served with. But I hope Kate's generation asks harder questions before committing their children to conflicts without clear purpose. Honor the warriors. Question the wars. Remember that every casualty had a family, a home, a life that mattered. Remember that our enemies were often as brave and skilled as we were. And remember that tactical brilliance means nothing without strategic wisdom." If you found this story meaningful, if you're someone who understands that history isn't simple and soldiers deserve respect even when wars don't make sense, then subscribe to this channel. Join our community of people who refuse to let these stories disappear, who refuse to simplify the complicated truth of combat into easy narratives. Every veteran's story matters. Every perspective deserves preservation. Hit that subscribe button now and help us honor the service of all who fought, regardless of which side of history they stood on. Because remembering honestly is the only way to honor them properly.